The morning did not begin with a decision. It had been made 10 years ago, quietly, on a November night when Minerva McGonagall had stood on a dark Surrey street and understood that she was not going to be listened to. The decision had been accumulating since then, patient, specific, unhurried, adding to itself a little more each year in the space she kept for things she was not finished with. And this morning, the 1st of September 1991, was only where it arrived. The castle kept its particular 1st of September silence. Not the silence of an ordinary night, which was simply absence, but a held, sort of quiet, something expectant in the stones, the way the whole of Hogwarts drew in its breath in the hours before the students returned and became itself again. The portraits dozed in their frames. The torches along the corridor burned at their lowest, as if conserving themselves. McGonagall had been at her desk since 3:30, and in all that time the grounds beyond her window had remained a darkness she could feel more than see, the lock invisible past the pre-dawn edge of the world. On the desk, a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, a stack of intake parchments for the incoming first years, already reviewed and set aside. And beside them, not exactly hidden, not exactly displayed, a slim notebook bound in brown leather, the cover worn soft at the corners from 10 years of being placed in a locked drawer and considered and put back. She had retrieved it. Before dawn, she had not yet opened it. She knew every word inside it, as well as she knew anything. She was 55 years old. She had worn this color, the deep, specific green of her robes, since before most of the students she was about to receive had been born, and she had long since ceased to notice it in the way people cease to notice their own faces. Her black hair was pinned in its bun with the efficiency of 3 decades of practice. Her glasses were on. She sat, as she always sat, straight-backed without effort, and she looked, to anyone who might have appeared in the doorway of her office at this hour and this state of the morning, precisely as she always looked on the 1st of September, composed, exacting herself. She had worked to achieve this effect. It was going to be necessary. She thought about November, the 1st, 1981. She thought about it the way she sometimes thought about it in the years since, not indulgently, not with the full weight of it, but in the precise and targeted way she thought about anything that required her to stay accurate. She had sat on a cold brick wall in a Surrey suburb in her animagus form for the better part of a day, watching a household conduct its thoroughly ordinary life, while the wizarding world turned inside out around it. She had written it down in the style she applied to formal documentation, because she was deputy headmistress, and that was what she did. She observed, she assessed, she recorded, did. She had found the Dursley household wanting on every criterion she had, and she had told Albus Dumbledore so, and Dumbledore had explained, with that particular warmth he deployed when closing a conversation he had already decided to win, that there were reasons that he could not share the full picture that she would understand in time. She had not understood in time. She had not understood in 10 years, which was the point. The quill of acceptance had inscribed Harry Potter's name in the Book of Admittance in August of 1980. She had seen it the following October, reviewing the roll of magical children by year as she did each autumn, noting addresses, beginning the long and quiet work of ensuring no child was overlooked. His address had been familiar, in the way that a bruise is familiar. She recognized it immediately, and felt its presence in her chest. She had written it into a second record of her own, and thought, 9 years she had set about waiting. The years had a texture she had not anticipated. She had expected, dimly, that some official avenue would present itself. A ministry channel, a welfare inquiry, something through which her documented concerns could be formally submitted and acted upon. None had materialized. Dumbledore did not revisit the matter. The subject of Harry Potter appeared in staff conversations only in the abstract, a name attached to a prophecy and a history and a destiny that everyone agreed was significant, and no one seemed to find it strange that the name also referred to a specific child living a specific life in a specific house that one member found wanting. The 31st of July, this past summer, Rubeus Hagrid had gone to Little Whinging with a letter. He had returned subdued, which was not his natural state. She had found him in the corridor outside the defense classroom, and she had asked him, simply, only the one question, how the boy was. Hagrid had been quiet longer than was natural. Then he had said, small. He had said, thin. He had said the boy had not known his own name in their world, had not known what had happened to his parents, had not known anything. He had been wearing clothes far too large for him, things plainly made for someone else. He had been surprised, Hagrid said, in the way of someone for whom a kind arrival at the door was not the expected thing. She had thanked him. She had gone into the empty classroom beside them, and stood at the window and looked at the grounds for a long time without seeing them. She had been right. She had stood on that cold Surrey street a decade ago and called it exactly as she saw it, and she had been right. And the boy had grown up precisely as she had known he would. Small, thin, uninformed, surprised by ordinary human attention, and she had been right about all of it, which had mattered not at all, because she had been ignored about all of it, which had mattered enormously. These were not the same thing, and the difference between them was a decade in a locked drawer. Today was what she was going to do about that. She stood. The notebook went into the inner pocket of her robes, which she had checked the depth of the previous evening, in a small and entirely deliberate act of preparation. She had been preparing for 6 weeks, since the 3rd week of August, when she had taken the notebook out for only the 2nd time, and read it beginning to end, and understood that the sorting ceremony was the only room she would ever have access to. The headmaster would be in his chair at the center of the high table. She would be at the lectern with her scroll. She knew the mechanics of what she was about to do. She had thought through the mechanics very carefully. She was aware that she was a deputy headmistress, stepping outside the boundaries of her role. She was aware that what she was about to do was not sanctioned, that it would not be well received, that it would cost her something she had not fully priced. She was also aware, had been aware for 10 years, with the settled certainty of someone who has run the same calculation many times and gotten the same answer every time, that the boy on the train from London deserved to walk into this school knowing that someone had been watching on November the 1st, 1981. That someone had written it all down, that someone had not let it go. She walked out of her office into the cold dark of the corridor and went to meet the train. The platform was already loud when Harry pushed through the barrier, and the noise hit him the way noise hit him in crowds, from all angles at once, without hierarchy. A scarlet steam engine sat at the platform's edge, breathing out slow exhalations of white steam. People were everywhere. Children dragging trunks, parents dispensing last instructions, owls contributing to the general chaos with the enthusiasm that came naturally to owls who had been caged all morning. Harry had Hedwig's cage in one hand and was hauling his trunk with the other, and he was wearing Dudley's second-best jeans and a shirt that was 2 sizes too large, and he was working very hard to look as though this was not the strangest thing that had ever happened to him. It was, in fact, the strangest thing that had ever happened to him. The previous contender had been the conversation with the snake at the zoo on his birthday, but that had at least been brief. He found a compartment about 2/3 down the train empty, except for a beetle, making confused circles on the window glass. He stowed his trunk with some difficulty and settled Hedwig's cage on the seat beside him. Hedwig regarded him with the dignified composure she reserved for situations she considered beneath comment. Harry sat down. He looked out at the platform, at the families saying goodbye, at the older students who moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of people who knew where they were going, and thought about how this was already the farthest he had been from Privet Drive, in any sense that counted, not in miles, since the Dursleys had taken him to the seaside once, but in the sense of a life that could plausibly contain things like this: a trunk with his name on it, a snowy owl, and somewhere ahead of him, a castle. The compartment door slid open. The boy who appeared had a long nose and a face full of freckles, and a look about him of someone who had been rushed by older siblings for so long that the impression of it had become permanent. He was wearing robes that had been let down at the hems with stitching that didn't quite match the original. He surveyed the empty seats with the studied casualness of someone who had checked and found nothing better. "Everywhere else is full," he said. "Can I?" "Yeah," Harry said. "Go ahead." The boy sat across from him. He was Ron Weasley, he said, the name delivered with the slight self-consciousness of someone accustomed to being the sixth of a thing. And Harry said he was Harry Potter, and Ron already knew this, which was evident from the way he tried not to look at Harry's forehead. Harry appreciated the effort considerably. He had been on the platform for less than an hour, and had already encountered two strangers who had simply stared at his scar, without any apparent awareness that this was rude. Ron's restraint felt by comparison like a sophisticated social grace. They settled into talking, which came more easily than Harry had expected, in the loose and testing way of people working out whether they like each other. Ron had 6 brothers and sisters, and had spent his whole life waiting to go to Hogwarts, and was slightly overwhelmed by the whole thing in a way he was mostly managing to conceal. Harry had been waiting too, though for 11 years he hadn't known what he was waiting for, and they found quickly that they had enough common ground to carry the conversation past the point where it might have trailed off. Eventually, with the particular carefulness of someone raising a topic they have been trying not to raise, Ron said, "Is it true you can't remember what happened with you-know?" "I was a baby," Harry said. "I don't remember any of it." Ron nodded slowly. "That must be strange," he said. "Everyone knowing something about your life that you don't." Harry said that yes, that was about right. It was also the thing that made people look at him in a specific way, a mixture of awe and pity and curiosity that he had no idea what to do with, and he had been trying since his birthday in July to get used to it without much success. He was famous for something he couldn't remember doing. Famous for surviving. Famous for the scar. He had spent 11 years being comprehensively ignored by the people he lived with, and now apparently the entire wizarding world knew his name, and he was still in the process of deciding whether those were as opposite as they sounded. The compartment door opened again. A girl appeared, bushy-haired, slightly harried, with the expression of someone who had already been in and out of several compartments and was becoming brisk about it. "Have you seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost his, Trevor, it's called. They had not." She looked at them both with a quick, assessing glance, paused for a fraction of a second on Harry's forehead in the distracted way of someone noting a fact and filing it away. And then she was gone, pulling the door shut behind her. "That's Hermione Granger," Ron said, with the tone of someone who had already formed an opinion. "She knew 6 spells before we'd even left London." The train travelled on through the afternoon, and the sky outside the windows went from grey to darker grey to a blackness that was specifically different from the ordinary dark of night, the dark of places where there is a great deal of sky and very little else. The train slowed and then stopped, and Harry heard Hagrid's voice before he could see anything, huge and warm and carrying across the noise of the station without apparent effort, calling for first years, all first years this way, please. They came down onto the platform in the damp cold, and Harry could smell water, a great deal of water, somewhere, close. The boats were wooden and small, and sat at the edge of a lake that was wide enough that the far shore was only a darkness in greater darkness. Harry climbed into one. The castle, which he had been told was somewhere ahead, was not yet fully visible, and then it was. It came above the tree line all at once, lit from within by what seemed like hundreds of windows, its towers rising against the sky with the unconcerned permanence of something that had been there long before anyone had thought to call it a school. It was reflected in the black water below with a completeness that made it seem doubled, as though the version in the water were the real one and everything above it were the copy. Harry looked at it and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for, not excitement exactly, though it was adjacent to that. More like recognition without memory, the feeling that this was the shape of the thing he had been without a word for. The boats crossed the water in a silence that nobody broke. They moved toward the light of the windows, and the castle grew ahead of them, and Harry sat with his hands around the edge of the boat and thought, here then, this, the new thing. The boats touched the far shore. Hagrid's lantern swung ahead of them as they filed out and up, through a damp passageway cut into the rock toward a door. He did not know as the door came into view what was waiting past it. He could not have. He knew only what was in front of him, the cold, the dark, the castle above, and the particular quality of standing at the beginning of something you cannot yet see the shape of. The door opened. They went in. She gathered them in the antechamber off the entrance hall, the way she did every year, 22 first years, arranging themselves in the general way of people who have not yet learned how to take up the correct amount of space in a room. They were damp from the lake crossing, most of them. One girl had a waterweed caught in her hair. Several of them were still looking around at the stonework and the torches, with the helpless wonder of people who have just understood that the place is real. McGonagall stood at the front of the room, with her scroll in her right hand and her hands at her sides, and she was very still, which was not the same as being unaware of things. The notebook was in the inner pocket of her robes. She could feel the slight, familiar weight of it. She gave the speech. She had given it for 30 years, and she gave it now exactly as she had always given it, precisely, without unnecessary warmth, which was not the same as without care. The 4 houses. The sorting, they would be sorted tonight. They would conduct themselves accordingly. Each house would be their family. She said it like a report because she was deputy headmistress, and that was how she communicated things she considered important, directly, completely, without embellishment. She found Harry Potter near the front left of the group. He was watching her with the careful lateral attention of a child who has learned to observe adults without appearing to observe them, and he was thin in the way that announced itself. Not merely slight, but specifically thin, the kind that went with ill-fitting clothes. She catalogued this without expression. She turned and led them into the great hall. He was watching her from 2 people back in the line. She was not warm exactly. She was something his brain reached for a word for, and came back with precise, which was a strange thing to think about a person. She reminded him of something he couldn't name, some quality of expectation. He followed her through the doors and forgot what he'd been thinking almost immediately, because the ceiling happened. He had been told about the ceiling. Ron had mentioned it on the train, and Hermione Granger had cited the book where she'd found the explanation. but being told was not the same as standing beneath it, a ceiling that wasn't there, that gave way instead onto the full depth of the night sky. Black in the way that only sky is black, with the weight of all the air above it, and scattered with more stars than he had ever been able to see from Privet Drive. 1,000 candles floated in the space between, steady despite the fact that nothing held them, and the light they gave was warm and slightly golden, and fell across 4 long tables of students who had all stopped what they were doing to watch the first years come in. The murmur started at the Gryffindor table and spread. Harry kept his eyes forward. At the far end of the hall, raised on a platform, the staff table ran the full width of the room. The teachers were seated in a row, robes of different colors, expressions ranging from curious to politely attentive. And at the center of the table was a chair that was larger than the others, not ornately so, but definitively. And in it sat an old man with a very long silver beard and half-moon spectacles, who was watching the first years arrive with an expression of such concentrated openness that Harry felt briefly seen. The man with the black hair was near the end of the row. His hair was dark and hung to his shoulders and had the quality of hair that was clean and still looked otherwise, and his face was sallow, and his robes were black. And when his eyes found Harry across the width of the hall, they were flat and cold in a way that Harry could feel between his shoulder blades. He looked away first. McGonagall set a very old hat on a stool at the front of the hall. It was battered in the manner of something that had been battered for a very long time and had no objections. It sat on its stool, and the great hall went quiet, and the hat opened along its brim and sang. It sang about Gryffindor and Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw and Slytherin, their qualities, their founders, their claims on the students who stood watching. The song was formal, in the way that things are formal when they have been formal for centuries. Harry listened and applauded with everyone else when it was done, and felt the particular small satisfaction of having participated correctly in something he didn't fully understand yet. McGonagall unfurled her scroll. The first years went still. She read the first name. A girl with pigtails walked to the stool. The hat came down over her eyes. The silence lasted 4 seconds, and then it called Hufflepuff, and the Hufflepuff table broke into applause, and the girl went to sit with them, beaming. The next name, a boy who took the hat off his head twice before he reached the stool and had to be waited for. Gryffindor. A girl who had been crying quietly since the entrance hall, and was no longer Ravenclaw, and the relief on her face was visible from where Harry stood. A tall boy Harry didn't know. Slytherin, to less applause than the others, but applause nonetheless. Then a girl with red plaits, who went to Hufflepuff, and looked as though this was exactly what she had expected. The rhythm was established now in the way rhythms became established. Name, walk, hat, house, applause, next. Harry watched and waited for his name, and thought about the hat, and whether it would be able to tell anything he wanted, kept private, which was a thought he put aside as unproductive. Then Professor McGonagall stopped. She had the scroll in her hands, and then she did not. She had lowered it. The next name had not been called. The rhythm, name, walk, hat, house, applause, had reached the end of itself without completion, and the hall registered this before any individual person had processed it. A subtle shift in the quality of the air, the older students at the 4 tables going alert the way people go alert when something deviates from what it is supposed to do. She reached into the inner pocket of her robes. The notebook she drew out was slim, brown leather, worn at the corners. She held it in both hands. She set the scroll on the lectern beside the stool. At the high table, the man with the silver beard and the half-moon spectacles looked at her across the length of the great hall with an expression that was very still and very attentive and entirely unreadable from where Harry stood. Several other members of staff had gone similarly still. The man with the black hair was a specific stillness, the kind that is not the absence of motion, but its deliberate suppression. Dumbledore did not speak. He looked at her, and she did not look at him, and the silence in the great hall had taken on a quality that Harry couldn't name, but could feel in his sternum, held as though 400 people had simultaneously remembered to breathe and then decided not to. She opened the notebook to the first page. She looked out at the assembled school. She said, "On November the 1st, 1981, I spent the whole of the day watching a Muggle family in Little Whinging, Surrey. I wrote down everything I observed." She cleared her throat. She began to read. She read the heading first, the way she read everything, without embellishment, without comment, without any inflection that could be characterized as drama. November the 1st, 1981. Number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Field observations, assessment of proposed placement. A pause, one breath. Then she began. She had arrived before first light. She read before the street was awake, before the household had stirred. She had taken her animagus form at the junction of the road, out of sight of the houses, in the dark. The cat that settled on the garden wall of number 4 was a silver tabby with markings around its eyes that resembled spectacles, which was not a coincidence, and it had sat there through the pre-dawn cold, without movement, because the woman inside the tabby cat had decided to sit there. She had taken up her position on the wall as the sky went from black to grey, and the street below her came slowly into its ordinary Thursday shape. A light in a window here, a letterbox rattling open there, the first car pulling out of a drive before most of the houses had any lights on at all. She had been making inquiries all day. Alongside her observations, she noted in the document, receiving information through the various channels available to her about what was happening in the wider wizarding world, which was, in brief, everything. She read the word celebrations and then read around it. The dispatches she had received about wizards abandoning their disguises in public places, about owls being spotted in broad daylight by confused muggles, about the word going through every corner of the magical world that it was over. She had been receiving these reports, she wrote, while sitting on a brick wall in Surrey watching a woman load a dishwasher through a sitting-room window, and she had found the contrast instructive. She had observed Petunia Dursley through the glass. She read, her movements through the visible portions of the downstairs rooms, the industry of a woman who managed her house with exacting attention to its presentation, and in McGonagall's observation, she was careful in what she claimed. She had been outside. She could only record what the window gave her. She recorded it. In the front rank of the unsorted first years, Harry's attention had collapsed to a single point. She had said, Privet Drive. She had said, Number 4. She had said, Little Whinging, Surrey, in precisely the tone in which she said everything, which was the tone of someone reporting a fact that was simply a fact, and Harry had heard those words, in the order he had been writing them on envelopes for Petunia since he was old enough to be handed a pen and asked to address things. He had lived at Number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey for 10 years and 9 months, give or take the time he had spent locked out of his room or sleeping in. He stopped, that thought he had lived there. This woman was reading its address aloud, in the great hall of Hogwarts, in front of the whole of the school, and he did not know her name, and he did not know why she had a notebook, and he could not look away from her. Beside him, Ron had gone entirely still. She read the record of Vernon Dursley's departure for work. 7:43 in the morning. She had clocked it with the precision she brought to anything she considered worth documenting. He had reversed his company car out of the drive and proceeded up the road. He had noticed the cat at the corner of the street. She noted, had glanced twice, she wrote, in the way of a man who had seen something his mind had not quite accepted as an appropriate thing to be seeing, and then had continued. Subject demonstrated mild unease at the animagus presence and did not investigate further. She had watched him go. She had returned her attention to the house. A sound had moved through the older students, low and lateral, the kind of thing that was not quite a murmur, more the collective hum of people recalibrating. She read her assessment of the household against the criteria she had applied. She had been a deputy headmistress for 11 years at that point, she wrote, and had some experience of what children required, in the ordinary course of things, and considerably more specific experience of what magical children required. Someone with the emotional range to accommodate what they were, someone who could love a child whose nature was in some meaningful sense foreign to their own. She had evaluated the Dursley household against these criteria with care. She had not found the criteria met. She looked up from the notebook for the first time since beginning. The hall met her. The Dursleys were, in her professional judgment, the worst sort of muggles imaginable. She returned to the page. Harry knew, in the part of his mind that was still processing the things around him, that the great hall was very large and very full of people, and that the ceiling above him was doing something that wasn't possible. He knew these things. They were not available to him in any useful way. What was available to him was this. The woman at the front of the room had been sitting on the garden wall at Privet Drive on November the 1st, 1981, and she had spent the day watching and writing, and she had concluded that the people in that house were the worst sort of muggles imaginable, and she had then, apparently, spent 10 years in possession of that conclusion without anyone acting on it, and now she was reading it aloud, and she was still going. He had known since July, Hagrid had told him, sitting in that hut on the rock with the rain coming in through the gaps. His parents had been murdered, Voldemort had fallen, he had survived. He had known since July that the 1st of November 1981 had been the night that everything changed. But knowing that a thing happened was not the same as having a witness. It had not occurred to him, in the weeks since Hagrid had appeared at the door, that anyone might have been there, that someone had been on that street on that specific day, watching and writing in the cold on top of a garden wall. She had seen it. She had been there. She had written it down. He did not know what to do with that. She read the midday entry. The street had settled into its afternoon quiet. She wrote, the household had continued its routines. The notable interruption to the ordinary character of the Muggle suburb, the thing that marked November the 1st, 1981, as different from any other Thursday in Little Whinging, was the owls. She had counted 11 between the hours of 11 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. Barn owls, tawny owls, a great grey that she had noted specifically for its unusual marking, flying in the open in full daylight, not troubling themselves with the convention of discretion. She had observed Muggles see them and look uncertain and decide not to think about it. She had found this, she wrote, dispiriting in a way that felt relevant to her broader assessment of the street. She had spent the afternoon, she noted, in a state she described with characteristic understatement as cognitive dissonance. She had been sitting on a wall in an ordinary suburb watching ordinary people do ordinary things while receiving reports that the entire wizarding world had erupted into celebration. She wrote about this, about the gap between the two realities, about the way Privet Drive had no idea what had happened 30 miles away the previous night, had no mechanism for knowing, would not have found it credible if told. She wrote about what it felt like to be in both worlds at once, and to find that they could not see each other. At the high table, the man in the throne-like chair at the center had not moved. He had his hands folded before him and his half-moon spectacles directed at the woman with the notebook, and his expression was of someone listening with complete and total attention. Along the table, professors leaned very slightly toward one another, not speaking, barely shifting, in the way of people conducting a conversation entirely through posture. The man with the black hair had not participated in this. He was sitting the same way he had been sitting when she drew out the notebook, and he was going to go on sitting that way. She turned a page. She read on. The hall had reached the particular silence of a room that has stopped expecting the ordinary thing to happen and has begun, instead, to wait. She had not finished. She read the afternoon entry. At approximately 5:30, she noted, Vernon Dursley had returned from his place of employment. She had observed his return from the garden wall, in the position she had maintained for the better part of the day. He had walked from his car to the front door, and he had noticed the cat. She wrote that she had stared at him in what he presumably experienced as an unsettling way because she had been staring at him for 9 hours and had not yet arrived at a satisfactory accounting of what she had found there, and the staring was by that point an act of concentration rather than aggression. She had written a note to herself beside this observation. She read it aloud, now in the same tone she had read everything. I stared because I was attempting to understand what kind of man this is. The kind of man who will be given the care of the most famous child in our world. The great hall did not move. She continued. She had compiled, she noted in the document, a list of qualities she considered necessary, not exceptional, she specified, but minimum necessary in any guardian of a magical child. She had some experience of what children needed to become themselves. She read the list, the capacity to accommodate information that contradicted their existing model of the world, some degree of emotional flexibility in the face of the unexpected, the willingness to love a child whose nature was substantially foreign to their own. She had evaluated the Dursley household against each criterion in turn. She had not found any of them present in any meaningful degree. She read the sub-entries under each criterion. They were not kind. They were precise, which was not the same thing, but frequently resembled it. She did not read them quickly. She read them the way she had written them, with a care that was itself a form of indictment, the care of someone who had sat on a wall all day and refused to look away. In the front of the assembled first years, Harry was standing with his arms at his sides and hearing himself described, not himself, the house, the family, the people he had lived with. But every word she read landed in the specific place where his experience of those people lived, and it landed with a particular resonance of recognition, not the recognition of being told something new, but the recognition of hearing someone else say aloud what you had always known. She had spent a day watching the Dursleys, and she had concluded, in formal language, the thing he had been concluding, informally for as long as he could remember, and she had written it down, and she had kept it. She reached the end of the assessment section. She turned to the next page. She read what she had written about Harry Potter's future. She would not be surprised, she noted, if the Wizarding World came to mark this day, November the 1st, 1981, as something, a day with a name. She wrote that there would be books written about this child. She wrote that every child who grew up in the magical world would know his name before they could read it. She wrote that he would be a legend before he understood what a legend was, and she wrote, "He will be at Privet Drive," knowing none of it. She did not look up when she read that line. She did not need to. At the high table, Severus Snape had not moved since she produced the notebook, and he was not going to move. He had established this as a fact about the next hour, or however long this took, in the same way he established other facts he needed to be certain of, by deciding it completely, early, and not revisiting it. He had been still for a long time. He was aware that the other members of staff along the high table could see his stillness and could, if they chose to apply themselves, find it notable. He was not thinking about them. He was thinking about a platform. King's Cross Station in September of 1971, which was a long time ago, and was not a long time ago in the way that the things which have never resolved themselves are never a long time ago. He had been 11 years old. Lily Evans had been 11 years old. They had been standing on platform 9 3/4 with their trunks and their new robes, and the specific mixture of terror and excitement that had made everything feel too bright, and Petunia Evans had been standing at the barrier watching her sister prepare to leave. He remembered her voice. He had been very good. Even at 11, at filing voices, filing them in the category of threat or non-threat, the category of safe or unsafe. And Petunia Evans's voice had always filed in a register that he associated with a particular kind of helpless anger, never accepted the telling. She had called Lily a freak. She had said it on that platform, in that crowd, in front of anyone who happened to be close enough, and Lily's face had done something that Snape had watched happen and had not been able to prevent, the brightness going out of it. Not all the way out. Lily was not easily extinguished, but out enough to be visible if you were watching closely. And he had always been watching closely where Lily was concerned. There had been a letter. He had known about the letter before that day. Lily had told him, or he had found out. The sequence was unclear now, but seeing it read aloud was different from knowing it existed. Petunia had written to Dumbledore. She had written, asking to come to Hogwarts. She was not magical. The letter had been returned with regrets. The matter was closed. As far as Dumbledore was concerned, on the platform, Lily had had the letter. She had read it. He had read it over her shoulder. The words of it were specific and formal, and very sad in the way that requests from people who know they are going to be refused are always a little sad. And Petunia had seen them reading it, and the expression that had crossed her face, the specific expression of someone who has just been seen in a vulnerability they had intended to keep private, had closed like a door. The insult she had delivered as she turned away was not a new word for what she felt. It was an old word. It was the word she used when the feeling became too large for silence. Snape was sitting very still at the high table in the Great Hall on September the 1st, 1991, and the woman at the front of the hall was reading from a notebook about a house in Surrey, about Petunia Dursley, about the household where Lily's son had grown up. And his hands were flat on the table in front of him, and he was not going to move them. He was aware, in the peripheral way of someone who has practiced this for many years, of the sensation of something in his chest that required not being acknowledged. He was very good at not acknowledging things. He had kept himself alive on that skill. He applied it now. The boy was standing in the front of the unsorted first years. He had Lily's eyes. He had noticed this when their eyes had met across the hall at the beginning of the evening, before the deviation from the ceremony had occurred, and noticing it had been a private matter, filed and managed. He was not going to look at the boy again if it could be helped. He was going to sit here and wait for this to be over, and then he was going to do what he always did, which was conduct himself as though none of it had happened, because conducting himself as though none of it had happened was the only strategy available to him. McGonagall turned a page. Snape did not look at her. He did not look at Dumbledore. He had a precise understanding of where Dumbledore's attention was directed, and he did not require visual confirmation. She was reading again. The afternoon, the late hours of it, the quality of the light she had noted in her systematic way, the quieting of the street as the day wound toward evening. She read with the same steady, deliberate pace she had maintained throughout, the voice of a woman who had been waiting for this for a long time and was not going to rush it now that it had arrived. At the 4 house tables, the older students were very still, the way people are still when they have lost track of how long they have been listening. She reached the end of the afternoon section. She paused. The hall heard the pause. She turned the page. She looked out at them, all of them, first years and 7th years and everyone between. The teachers at the high table, the boy in the front row with his mother's eyes and his father's unruly hair, and the 10 years of Privet Drive written in the specific way he stood, the way he was trying not to look as though this was too much. She turned to the evening entry. She continued. The evening entry began with the lights going out. She read it plainly. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, a figure she recognized had appeared at the end of Privet Drive, and had produced from his pocket a small silver device. The street lamps along the road had gone dark in sequence, each one swallowing its own light, until the street was entirely without it. She noted in the document that this was efficient and thorough and characteristic, and that she had watched it from the wall with the specific quality of attention she had been applying to the day since before first light. She read the words he had said to her when he arrived at the wall. She read them in her own voice, which was the voice she had been using for everything, the voice that did not perform things. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly," and she read what she had said back. "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day." A sound moved through the hall. Not laughter exactly, something adjacent to it, in the shorter, sharper register of people who had been holding their breath and had briefly forgotten to hold it. It subsided. She continued. She read the argument that followed, her transformation back into human form. Her objection to the plan, stated in full and stated plainly. The Dursleys were unsuitable in every relevant respect. She had documented this over the course of the day. She would be happy to enumerate further if that was useful. She had argued, she noted, that there were other options. That wizarding families might be found, that the boy could be placed with people who could prepare him, who could give him some grounding in the world he was going to inherit. She had argued, she wrote, with the thoroughness the situation warranted. She noted also what she had been told in response. She had been told, she read, that there were reasons, that these reasons were significant, that the placement was not arbitrary and not uninformed, and that if she had the full picture, she would understand. She wrote that she had asked for the full picture. She wrote that the full picture had not been provided. She wrote, I recorded his assurance that the reasons were sufficient. I did not find the assurance sufficient. At the high table, Dumbledore had his hands folded before him, and was listening to his own past in the way of someone who has carried a thing for a very long time and had not expected, at this particular juncture of a Tuesday evening, to have it narrated to a school. She read the arrival. She had been standing with Dumbledore at the end of the drive, she noted, when the sound of an engine had become audible, a low, powerful sound, the kind that preceded something large. She wrote about the motorbike, emerging from the dark, above the houses, the enormous motorbike, dark-colored, belonging to Sirius Black, who had lent it for the purpose to a man substantially too large for most conventional means of transport. She wrote about Hagrid landing it at the end of the drive with the careful imprecision of someone whose natural scale made precision a relative concept. She wrote about what Hagrid had been carrying. Baby Harry, she had written, approximately 15 months old, wrapped in a blanket, asleep. She read that line without pause. The child was asleep. I do not think he knew where he was being taken. She read the last of the operational entries. Dumbledore's letter placed beneath the sleeping child on the doorstep of number 4. The door of the house, still closed, would not open until morning. She had watched from the end of the drive as he bent down and set the child on the stone step. She had written one further sentence about this moment, which she read, "I have stood at a great many deathbeds in my life. I have learned to distinguish between a death and a disappearance. What I watched on the doorstep of number 4 was not a handover. It was a vanishing act." She paused. She turned to the last page. Dumbledore was not at this moment hearing it. He was in 1981 on a cold Surrey street, and he was watching Minerva McGonagall's face when he told her the picture was not hers to have. He had watched her face do what it always did when she was processing something she found inadequate, go perfectly, precisely, still, in the manner of a woman deciding which of her available responses was correct. She had chosen, that night, to say nothing further. She had watched him place the child on the step. She had disapparated without another word. He had never doubted the necessity. He wanted to be precise about that, even here, even now, in the privacy of his own mind, with the hall around him and Minerva's voice filling it. He had never doubted the necessity of the blood protection, had never thought there was another way that did not risk everything, had understood the mechanics of the old magic with the clarity that came from decades of study and the specific gravity that came from understanding that the alternative was a child with no protection at all in a world where the thing that had wanted to kill him was not as dead as it appeared. He had known this. He had acted on it. He had not always been certain the cost was proportionate. These were not the same thing. He had known the placement was necessary, and he had not always been certain that necessary, and just were the same category. And he had held these two things alongside each other for 10 years in the way that one held things that could not be resolved carefully. He was looking at them directly now, because Minerva was making him. She had had 10 years to decide how she felt about what she had not been told. He could see the product of that decade in the steadiness of her voice and the straightness of her back, and the fact that she had stood in front of the whole school and read every word she had written, without once, not once, across all of it, performing her feelings for the room. She had reported, she had documented, she had read from the record. He found that he had known she would do it this way. He found that he had, in some part of himself he had not consulted, always known she would do it eventually. He became aware again of the hall, of the silence it was holding, of the first years at the front of the room, one of them in particular, standing in the way of someone who has gone very still to avoid accidentally feeling too much. She had said, the final entry. McGonagall looked up from the notebook. She held the hall's attention the way she held everything, without effort, without performance, simply by being the kind of person who, when they chose to speak, found that rooms listened. The final entry, she said, is not an observation. I wrote it in the early hours of November the 2nd, after I had returned to Hogwarts. It is what I could not say to Albus Dumbledore on the night of November the 1st, 1981. She looked down at the page. She read, "I believe we will regret this. I hope I am wrong." She closed the notebook. The great hall was completely silent. The candles burned. The ceiling held its stars, steady and unhurried, the way the sky was steady and unhurried, indifferent to what happened beneath it, which was either comforting or terrible, depending on the night and who you were. 400 people did not move, did not speak. The fire in the sconces along the walls burned the same way it had been burning since the ceremony began, and nothing in the room acknowledged that something had just finished, because things that have just finished require a moment before any of the available responses, speech, movement, breath, become appropriate again. Dumbledore looked at her. She was standing with the closed notebook in both hands, looking at no one in particular, waiting. He had been too surprised to act at the start, and then it had been too late to stop it without making the stopping worse than the reading, and then, somewhere in the middle of it, somewhere in the afternoon entries, and in the flat and precise language of a woman who had written down what she saw, without flinching from any of it, he had understood that he was not going to act at all. Not because he lacked the authority. She had been right on November the 1st, 1981, and she was right tonight, and there were things you could not, in good conscience, stop simply because you found them costly. He did not speak. It was the sound of 400 people discovering, more or less simultaneously, that a breath was something they could take. Dumbledore rose from the chair at the center of the high table with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had decided, between one moment and the next, that this was the thing to do now. He did not look at McGonagall. He looked at the school. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, quieter than the room required, quieter than the distance required, and yet it carried. The way voices carried when the people producing them had spent long enough in large rooms to understand. He said Professor McGonagall's concerns about Harry Potter's placement had been heard and carefully considered a decade ago. The decision made at that time had been made with Harry's safety as its governing purpose. He wished to acknowledge, he said, the sincerity of Professor McGonagall's commitment, the care she had demonstrated tonight and had clearly demonstrated for some time, and he wished to acknowledge that her observations, as read. He paused, he said, there were things he had been unable to share at the time. There were things he remained unable to share. Now he asked if they would, for the sorting to continue. The hall did not move. The first years at the front of the room did not move. The older students at the 4 tables did not move. Not in defiance, not loudly, not with any performed resistance, but with the particular quality, not moving, that belongs to people who have heard something that has rearranged them slightly, and cannot simply put themselves back in order by being asked to. The 7th years who had been born during the war, who had grown up in households where the name Voldemort was spoken carefully if it was spoken at all, who had been told as children that a baby had done something that no one fully understood and that the world had been saved, they were not going to pretend the last 40 minutes hadn't happened because the headmaster had used the word please. Dumbledore waited. He was very patient. He had been patient for a very long time, about a great many things. Harry was standing in the front rank of the unsorted first years, and he had been standing there for the better part of an hour. He was aware of this, in the specific way you became aware of things that had ceased to be temporary, the standing, the waiting, the being. The subject, of things that were being said, in a room he did not know the rules of. He had been listening. He had been listening to a woman he still did not know by name read about his house and his family and what she had thought of them, and all of it had been absorbing in the way of something that was real and therefore requiring more processing than was currently available. He had been processing. He was not angry. He had thought, standing there, that he might be angry, that anger was the correct response to this situation, that it was what he was supposed to feel, while 400 strangers learned the details of his bedroom, or what had passed for his bedroom, or what had been technically allocated to him as a sleeping space since he was old enough to be moved out of the cupboard into Dudley's second. He had been thinking about that, actually. About the bedroom he had been given after the Hogwarts letters started coming. About the fact that before the letters he had been somewhere else. About where he had been, he did not know why he said it. He was 11, and he was standing in a room whose rules he did not know, and something had connected in his head. What the woman had said about the house, what Dumbledore had just said about the placement. The word protection, and the question formed and came out of him before the part of his brain that managed things like whether this is appropriate to say had a chance to weigh in. He said, "Is that why I slept in a cupboard?" He had not said it loudly, he had said it at the volume of someone who was asking a genuine question and was not yet thinking about the audience. It was the volume of a child who wants to know something. The silence that followed was not the same as the silence that had followed the closing of the notebook. The silence after the notebook had been wide. A silence of the kind that belongs to a room that has just witnessed something and does not yet know what to do with it. This silence was sharp, pointed. The kind that came from a single unexpected word dropped into a room that had been holding its collective breath and then suddenly had something new to hold it about. 400 people did not look at Dumbledore. 400 people looked at Harry. Harry became aware, in the 2 seconds after he spoke, of how many people were in the room. The awareness arrived in the manner of something that had been temporarily suspended and had now resumed: the candles, the ceiling, the 4 long tables, the hundreds of faces, all of which were now oriented in his direction. He did not look away. He had said the thing. Looking away would have been worse. Dumbledore looked at him. Harry looked back. He was 11 years old, and he was very tired in a way that was not the tiredness of the journey or of the late hour, not the tiredness that slept off overnight, the older kind, the kind that had been there for long enough to stop registering as a thing in particular and had become, instead, simply the temperature of being alive in the context he had been alive in. He was not angry. He was something else, something that did not have a clear name yet, and he held Dumbledore's gaze with it. McGonagall did not speak. She was standing at the lectern with the closed notebook in her hands, and she was watching. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment longer than was comfortable, long enough that the room registered it as a choice rather than a pause, and then something shifted in his expression. Not visibly, not in a way that could have been described from across the hall, but Harry was closer than most, and he was watching closely. Dumbledore said, "No." He said it simply, in the same quiet voice he had been using since he stood. He said, "No. It is not why you slept in a cupboard." He looked down at his hands. He looked at them the way people looked at their hands when they were locating, in the familiar geography of them, something they needed in order to continue. He said, "That is a different failure. And it is mine. No further explanation, no softening, no administrative language to put it in context." He had said the word failure in the same quiet voice. The word had its ordinary weight, plus the considerable additional weight of the room and the occasion and the specific man who had produced it. He did not look up immediately. When he did, he looked not at Harry but at McGonagall, and he said, with the particular quality of someone who was asking rather than directing, which was a distinction the room registered even if it could not have named it, would she continue the sorting? McGonagall looked at him. She set the notebook on the lectern. She picked up the scroll. She unrolled it. The hall breathed. It was a collective thing, distributed through 400 people. something the room did, rather than any individual in it. What had just happened was not resolved. The reading had occurred, the notes were in the room. The word failure had been spoken in front of the school by the man who held the authority it implicated, and none of that was going to become undone by the ceremony resuming. But there was a difference between things that were unresolved and things that had nowhere to go, and the hall had understood in the exhaling moment that this one had somewhere to go. Not tonight, but somewhere. Harry turned back toward the stool and the hat, with the uncertain coordination of someone whose body has decided to keep functioning through circumstances his mind hasn't finished processing. He faced the front. He was still in the front rank. He was still unsorted. McGonagall read the next name from the scroll. The ceremony continued. The scroll unrolled in McGonagall's hands with the small, crisp sound of something returning to its proper work. She read the next name. The hall remained different in the quality of its attention, not less quiet, not less attentive, but listening in a way that was aware of itself, a room of people who have just been through something and have not yet decided what to do about it. The first years, still standing in front of the stool, stood with the particular stillness of children who have been very still for a very long time and have run out of strategies for managing it. Older students at the 4 tables watched Harry Potter and then very carefully watched other things. The candles burned, unchanging, above all of it. A girl with dark plaits walked to the stool. The hat slid down over her forehead and thought for exactly 2 seconds before calling Hufflepuff. She sat at the Hufflepuff table, and the table applauded, and the ceremony continued. Granger, Hermione, the girl who had come into Harry's train compartment looking for a toad, came forward with a book under her arm and had to be reminded by McGonagall's slight look to leave it on the floor beside the stool. She appeared to find this difficult. The hat took slightly longer with her than it had with anyone so far, long enough for something to shift in her expression. A private argument, visible briefly, then resolved. It called Gryffindor. Hermione Granger removed the hat with her free hand, picked up her book with the other, and went to the Gryffindor table at a pace that suggested she had already identified where she intended to sit. 2 more after her. A boy with a pronounced stammer and a boy without. Ravenclaw, then Gryffindor, the rhythm had resumed. Name, hat, house, applause. But the rhythm itself had the quality of something that has noticed its own regularity, which is a different thing from being simply regular. Longbottom Neville, the boy who had lost his toad on the train, came forward, conducting a significant internal argument about whether his legs were going to carry him the full distance to the stool. They did. The hat considered him for considerably longer than it had considered the previous students, long enough that the hall began very slightly to hold its breath again, and then it called Gryffindor with a decisiveness that appeared to surprise even Neville. He looked at the hat as he took it off, as though checking whether it had meant him. Then he went to the Gryffindor table, and the table applauded Malfoy, Draco. The boy who had been standing with particular composure in the front rank of the first years, the boy who looked as though he had practiced standing in the front rank of things and found it natural, walked to the stool without any variation in pace. He sat down. He looked at no one. McGonagall placed the hat on his head, and the hat barely touched his hair before it shouted, "Slytherin!" The Slytherin table reacted with the satisfied promptness of people who had expected this outcome. Draco Malfoy went to his table, and he did not look back at Harry as he sat down. Harry watched him go. He had met Draco Malfoy on the boat crossing. He had not found the meeting particularly informative. Then, several more sortings, the names passing through the hall in McGonagall's level voice, and the responses of the hat and the 4 tables finding their ordinary rhythm. Harry was aware of time passing, in the way you were aware of time when you knew something was approaching. He had been aware of this for the better part of the last hour, his own name somewhere down the scroll, while everything else in the room had been happening. "Potter Harry," she said it the same way she had said all the others. The same level voice, the same moderate volume. There was nothing in the delivery to indicate that this name was different from any other on the roll. The hall received it as though it were not the same as any other on the roll. Harry walked forward. He was aware, in the specific way of someone who has recently been the subject of several hundred people's attention, that he was still being watched. But it was different now. The watching had shifted. Earlier in the evening, the watching had been about who he was. Now it was about what he had just done. He walked past the front rank of the older students at the Gryffindor table, toward the stool at the front of the hall, and he sat down, and McGonagall placed the hat on his head, and it fell down over his eyes, and the hall disappeared. "Well," said the hat, it did not say it the way he had expected, if he had known to have expectations, which he hadn't. It said it the way people said well when they had sat down across a table from something complex and were taking a moment before beginning. "Quite an evening you've had." He didn't know if he was supposed to respond. He thought, "I didn't do anything." The hat seemed to find this interesting. "No, someone else did the thing, and it was about you, and you had to stand in the middle of it. That is not the same as nothing." He thought, "Can you hear everything? Everything that matters." A pause that was not quite a pause, more the sensation of being considered from several angles at once, the way you were considered by people who were trying to be fair. You have considerable grief here. More than you know yet. You have been carrying it long enough that you have stopped noticing it as a distinct thing. It has become the temperature of everything else. He didn't argue with this. Now, you're wondering which house. Let me be honest with you. There is something here that would work in Slytherin. Not ambition, precisely, but the intelligence required to survive in a situation where you have no power and must understand your environment before it understands you. You have been doing that for 11 years. It is not nothing. Not Slytherin, Harry thought. He thought it the way you thought things, when they were not quite a request and not quite a command. A simple statement of preference, held clearly. "Yes," said the hat. "I hear you, and I want to explain why I'm not arguing." It was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of indecision, but of something finding the exact right words. Because of what you did tonight, Harry waited. Not the standing, not the listening. You didn't have a choice about those. But there was a moment, I can see it clearly, sitting right here, when you were 11 years old, in a room full of 400 people who had just heard the story of your life read aloud. And a very important man in a very important chair had just said something carefully diplomatic about why it had gone the way it went, and something connected. And you asked the question, Harry thought. "I didn't know I wasn't supposed to." "No," the hat agreed. "You didn't know. You have never been taught that the rooms you are in belong to you the way they belong to other people. You have been taught, by very consistent example, over 11 years, that you are the subject of decisions rather than a participant in them. And tonight, without knowing you were doing something that required courage, without being able to distinguish it as courage, because nobody ever taught you the difference, you spoke into the silence of a room that had stopped breathing and asked a man in authority a question about your own life. A brief, conclusive pause. That I can work with. Gryffindor. The word filled the hall from the brim of the hat, and the hat was lifted from his head, and Harry was back in the room. Candles, ceiling, 4 tables, 400 people. and the Gryffindor table was applauding in the particular way of people who have decided rather than simply reacted. The sound was more deliberate than the applause that had greeted the others, and it did not pretend to be the same. He went to the table. He found a space. He sat down. Across the hall, from the green-draped table, Draco Malfoy watched him without expression. McGonagall's voice, unchanged. Weasley, Ronald. Ron, who had been standing in the first year's front rank with the tightly maintained composure of someone trying very hard not to think about his own turn, walked forward with his chin up. The hat was on his head for under a minute before it called Gryffindor, and the table received him with the warmth of people who were very glad to have something uncomplicated to celebrate. Ron sat down next to Harry. He said nothing. He exhaled. Harry looked at him. Ron looked back. This passed for enough. McGonagall called the next name from the scroll. The ceremony moved on. The feast was real food. That was the thing Harry kept coming back to, even while everything else was happening. The hall returning to itself, the talking and the noise, and the older students who kept glancing over at the Gryffindor table with expressions he didn't have names for yet. He ate. He ate roast chicken and roast potatoes and things he recognized and things he didn't, and he ate in a particular way he had been eating for exactly 1 month, since the night in the hut on the rock when Hagrid had appeared with a slightly squashed birthday cake and the first indication that the world was larger than he had been told. He had been eating this way for a month and hadn't stopped being surprised by it. Full was still a thing that surprised him. Ron ate beside him without looking at him, which Harry had already understood was Ron's version of consideration. The prefect, whose name Harry hadn't caught, led them out of the great hall and through a series of corridors that Harry stopped trying to memorize halfway up the 3rd staircase. The castle was large, in the way that it seemed to keep adding rooms when you weren't paying attention to where you were going, which was probably the wrong time to not pay attention to where you were going. He followed the red and gold and the prefect's voice telling them things about the common room password and the schedule and the library hours, and it entered his ears and exited again without leaving much behind. Gryffindor Tower was he didn't have a word for it. The common room was lit and warm and full of things to look at, and the other Gryffindors were loud and welcoming in the specific way of people who had been told they were welcoming and had taken it seriously. He shook the hands that were offered and nodded at the faces and said yes to the question about his scar twice before he understood what was being asked. Then Ron appeared at his elbow and said, with the manner of someone performing a rescue operation, that they should probably find the dormitory. They found it. The other boys of their year, 4 of them, names Harry had already half lost, were getting into beds with varying degrees of ceremony. The room was circular, with 5 beds against the curved wall, and someone had already brought their trunks up. Harry's was at the end, near the window. He sat on the edge of his bed without unpacking and looked at it. The castle went quiet. Somewhere in the floors below, the sounds of the older students in the common room subsided by degrees. The other boys in the dormitory settled. Harry could tell, in the specific way of someone who had spent years listening to a house go to sleep, which of them were actually asleep and which were lying awake in the dark doing an impression of it. Ron was in the bed next to his. He had been quiet since the staircase. "You all right?" he said finally. He said it into the dark, at a volume that wasn't quite a whisper, the volume of something he'd been working up to. Harry thought about it. Ron said, "Yeah, that's probably the right answer. Silence." The window showed the beginning of a clouded Scottish sky, not much lighter than the room. Harry looked at it without looking at anything in particular. He said, "Can they? The wizarding world. Can they just, if a Muggle family is bad with a kid, is there a way to take the child somewhere else?" Ron was quiet for long enough that Harry thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, I think there are people who deal with that sort of thing, like, officially. But I don't actually know. My mum would know." He paused. "I don't know," Harry nodded in the dark. He hadn't expected a different answer. He wasn't sure he'd expected any answer. It was the kind of question he'd never had anyone to ask before, and he'd asked it before, thinking about whether that was strange. "The cupboard," he said. He said it the way you introduced a topic you were going to say more about. Ron waited. "I told them. In the hall, I said." Harry stopped. He reorganized before Hogwarts, before the letter. "I slept in a cupboard under the stairs." He said it at the same volume he'd said everything else, which was a small, level volume, and without anything in his voice that could be called distress. This was genuinely how he said it, not a performance of being fine. It had simply been his normal. You did not perform calm about your normal. There was a padlock, he said, on the outside of the door, and shelves, cleaning things, the mop and the hoover and boxes of whatever. I had a camp bed in the back. He thought about what else to say. If the Dursleys had people over, I wasn't allowed out. I'd hear them in the kitchen. I'd hear the telly. He was looking at the ceiling. The ceiling was dark, stone, and considerably more interesting than any ceiling he'd tried to sleep under before. He became aware, as he finished speaking, that Ron had not moved. "When they said I had to write to them," Harry said, "the school, for my Hogwarts letter, I had to put the address. I didn't know whether to write the house or the cupboard." "I wrote the house." Ron said nothing for a while. Harry could hear him breathing, careful, deliberate breaths. The breaths of someone who was deciding what to do with what they'd just been given. He said at last, "You know she kept those notes for 10 years. Harry looked at the ceiling. "Yeah, she wrote it down and then she kept it for 10 years. Ron seemed to feel this was worth sitting with rather than adding to. He was quiet. "Then, I don't know. That's a long time to keep something." He didn't know yet how to feel about it. That was the truth of it. He'd been in the hall when she read, and he'd heard everything she read, and at some point during it, somewhere around the assessment of what the Dursleys were like as people. The precise formal language of the worst sort of muggles imaginable. Something in his chest had done something he couldn't name. Not crying, adjacent to something. He'd been listening to a woman he didn't know read out a thing she'd written in the year he was born, and the thing she'd written was about the family she'd watched on the day the world changed. And she had disagreed with what they decided to do with him, and she had written it down, and she had kept it, and she had waited until he arrived to read it aloud. He didn't know what you were supposed to feel about that. He didn't have a framework for it. He'd never had anyone make a document about him before. "She doesn't seem like a soft person," he said. He meant it as an observation. "No," Ron agreed. "She's terrifying. Fred says she once deducted points from Percy for having a quill out of place." "Percy?" He paused, apparently considering the scale of the achievement. "She's also, she read it in front of everyone." With Dumbledore right there, Harry thought about Dumbledore's face. The look at his hands. He had not been able to describe what the expression on Dumbledore's face had done during the reading, because he hadn't known how to watch it and hear the reading at the same time. He'd had to choose. He'd listened. "What he said," Ron said, at the end. Before your name was called, what he said, he didn't finish the sentence. He seemed to think the sentence finished itself. Harry thought, that is a different failure, and it is mine. He hadn't known adults said things like that. He hadn't known they were allowed to say things like that to an 11-year-old in front of the whole school. He hadn't known it was possible for someone in authority to say, "This is mine," about a failure in the way that people said normal things, without hedging it with policy language, without making it smaller. He hadn't known what to do with that either. "I'm going to ask her," he said. He wasn't sure, as he said it, exactly what he was going to ask. He thought it probably had to do with the reasons Dumbledore said there were, the reasons that had been recorded in her notes as his reasons, the reasons that apparently couldn't be shared with him even now. He thought he wanted to understand them. He thought he had a right to. He was 11. He'd never thought before tonight that he had a right to understand things done to him. That was new. "Yeah," Ron said. The word had a quality of endorsement in it, not elaborate, just present. The word of someone who thought asking was a reasonable plan and was willing to say so. The castle settled around them. The window showed nothing but cloud. Harry looked at it for a while. He thought about full plates and padlocks and notebooks kept for 10 years, and about the hat's voice in the dark under the brim, reading him back to himself with a clarity no one had applied to him before. He thought about Ron's face on the platform at King's Cross, equally lost, equally trying not to show it. He thought about the morning, the way there would be a morning in a few hours in this tower that was his now. Whatever else was also true. He fell asleep before he'd finished thinking. The dark and the quiet took him, unhurried, the way they took people who had run out of room to hold more. The note had been slipped under her office door sometime during the feast, a folded square of cream parchment with her name on the front in familiar handwriting. He would be grateful for her company this evening when she had a moment. It was signed with his initials only. She had read it, set it down on her desk, and returned to the great hall to see the first years settled and the older students dispersed to their towers. She had done this methodically, in the order that things were supposed to be done in, with the same expression she wore when she was performing a task she had decided to perform regardless of what else was happening. Then she had gone to his office. The door opened when she knocked. It always did, which she had always found slightly irritating, the way everything in his domain was arranged to accommodate him, even the doors he was sitting. He had a cup of something in front of him that was not quite tea, and he looked, she noticed, like someone who had spent a long evening being very still in a large chair and was now in a different chair. He was old. She had known him for most of her adult life, and she was occasionally freshly struck by how old he was, in the way of something you knew abstractly and then encountered directly. He gestured toward the chair across from him. She sat. She was not apologetic. She was not triumphant. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has spent 10 years carrying something heavy and has just set it down and is discovering, now that her hands are empty, that she is not certain what to do with them. He said, "You acted without speaking to me first." She said, "Yes." A pause. He looked at his cup. She looked at him, looking at his cup. He said, "I want to tell you something I should have told you 10 years ago. I ask that you allow me to finish before you respond, because the full picture requires some time to convey, and I don't want us to be interrupted by the early portions of it." She said, "Go ahead," he began. The magic, he said, was old. Older than either of them, older than Hogwarts, older than the formal study of it. It belonged to a category that wizarding tradition called sacrificial protection, which was rare because the conditions that produced it were rare. A death given freely, in love, in the deliberate exchange of one life for another, to an enemy who had offered another choice. Lily Potter had that choice on the night of October 31st, 1981. She was offered her life if she stood aside. She did not stand aside. She died to protect her son, and the love she died with became something that lived in the blood of the child she died for. It was not a metaphor. It was literal, ancient magic. It lived in Harry's blood. He paused. He said the magic required something to function. It required Harry to call the home of a blood relative his own, at least once a year, until he came of age, at 17. It required the relative to be of Lily's blood, not James's. Lily had one surviving blood relative, her sister Petunia Dursley, whose home was 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. For as long as Harry Potter called that house his home, even once a year, even nominally, for as long as Petunia's blood acknowledged the claim, Voldemort, who was dispersed but not destroyed, could not touch him. He said, "Voldemort is not dead, Minerva. He is diminished, without body, perhaps for years, but he is not dead. And what drove him from Harry's body that night has left its inverse in Harry's blood. The moment the blood protection fails, the moment Harry is permanently removed from Petunia's household, the moment the tie is severed, whatever remains of Voldemort gains access to him. There was no wizarding family I could have placed Harry with that would have offered him equivalent protection. There was no arrangement. There was only Petunia's house. There was only that house and that street, and the sister Petunia did not want. He stopped. He looked at her. McGonagall was silent for a long time. The fire did what fires do in quiet rooms. She was not looking at it. She was looking at the space slightly to the right of his face, which was where her eyes went when she was processing something that required the full allocation of her attention and did not want the distraction of a human face. Then she said, "Why did you never tell me?" He said, "I judged that you didn't need to know." "You judged," she said. She said it very precisely, the way you said a word when you wanted to make sure it was heard as the word it was. "In 1981, and in 1982, and in every year since." He said, "Yes," she said, "I want to be exact with you about what your judgment cost, so that you understand what I am about to say. In 1981, I argued for removing Harry from the Dursley household. You know this because you were there. I argued on the grounds that they were unsuitable, inadequate as guardians, unable to love him, unprepared for what he was. You told me there were reasons. I asked for the reasons. You declined to share them. I argued for removal, because that was the only argument available to me with the information I had. I was fighting the placement itself, because I had no other target." She stopped. She let that sit. "If you had told me what you have just told me, I would not have argued for removal. I would have argued for oversight. Formal monitoring, regular contact from a qualified adult who could document conditions, report what she found, apply pressure where pressure was needed. I would have made a completely different argument, and it would have been a better argument, and perhaps it would have been harder to decline. You did not give me the chance to make it because you told me nothing." He said, "I was aware that was a possible consequence of my decision, and you made the decision anyway." "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Now I want to ask you something. Your philosophy of need to know, the judgment that certain people at certain times require certain pieces of information and not others, because you have assessed that the full picture is not yours to give. Does that philosophy apply to the child himself?" He was quiet. She said, "Harry Potter is 11 years old. He slept in a cupboard under the stairs for the first 9 years of his life. He asked a question tonight in front of 400 people about why he slept in a cupboard, and the reason he asked it in front of 400 people rather than in a private room with a responsible adult is that no responsible adult had ever offered him a private room. He had never been given a space in which that question was available to him. He did not know he was allowed to ask it until he asked it without knowing he was asking." She paused. Did he need to know? Did the child whose life was organized around this placement need to understand why his life had been organized this way. Dumbledore looked at his hands. It was the same gesture he had made in the hall, the same deliberate locating of something in the geography of familiar things. She watched it, and she knew what it meant, and she did not fill the silence. He said very quietly, there were failures. Yes, he said, the placement was necessary. The blood protection is the only thing standing between him and a dark force that has not finished with him. I chose the least terrible available option in a situation where the terrible was the only currency. I know, she said. I understand that now. I am not telling you the placement was wrong in the way I told you in 1981. I am telling you that necessary does not mean without cost, and that the cost was paid by an 11-year-old boy who had no say in the currency and no knowledge of the transaction. She looked at him steadily. He asked, tonight, why he slept in a cupboard. He asked it publicly because that was the only room available to him. You said, in front of the school. That is a different failure, and it is mine. I want to know whether you meant it. A silence. He said, yes, I meant it. She held his look for a moment, then she said, what happens now? He said. He must return to Privet Drive at the end of term. He must call it home. At least once before the protection can be reinforced for another year. This is not negotiable. Not by me, not by anyone. The magic is older than either of us and does not respond to argument. She said, with oversight this time. He said, I will consider what form that takes. She said, consider it carefully. She stood. She straightened her robes, which did not need straightening, a habit of hers, a thing her hands did when she was closing a conversation. She looked at him from her full height. You told me tonight what you should have told me in 1981. I am grateful for it. I am also going to tell you something you may already know. I have been watching Harry Potter's name in the Book of Admittance for 10 years. I have been watching, and I have been waiting, and I have been kept from acting with complete information because you decided I did not need it. That is finished now. I have the full picture. She moved toward the door. She said without turning, I will be watching. She left him with the fire and the cup and the quiet of the room where he had made 10 years of decisions alone. And she walked back through the dark corridors of Hogwarts toward her own office, and she was not triumphant, and she was not at peace. And she was something she did not have a clean word for, a woman who has just learned that she was right about the wrong thing, that her diagnosis was correct, and her remedy was always going to fail, that someone she trusted made a choice she would not have made with the same information, and that she cannot go back and make the argument she would have made with it. She cannot go back. She can only go forward with the full picture, watching. She had always been good at watching. She had 10 years of practice. The knock came before the light did. Harry was already awake, had been awake for some time, in the particular way of someone whose sleep has run out before their body has quite finished needing it. He was looking at the dark stone of the ceiling in the unfamiliar dark when he heard the knock at the dormitory door, and then a prefect's voice saying, Potter, and his name in someone else's mouth was still strange enough to make him sit up before he'd decided to. He dressed in the dark. The other boys breathed in the rhythm of genuine sleep. Ron made a sound and then subsided. Harry found his glasses on the bedside table and put them on, and the room sharpened, and he went to the door and found the prefect, a tall 6th-year girl whose name he hadn't retained, who told him Professor McGonagall wanted to see him in her office before breakfast. She said it with the neutrality of someone delivering a message, not a verdict. He followed her through the tower and down through the portrait hole and into the corridors of the castle, which looked different in the very early morning light, cooler, more itself, stripped of students and the various purposes that students introduced. He had time, on the walk, to think about what it meant when an adult called you in early, before breakfast, before the day had properly started, for a reason that had not been explained. He had 10 years of experience to draw on. The experience said, "It is rarely good news." She left him at a door he hadn't been to before. He knocked. Her voice said, "Come in." McGonagall's office was lit and organized in the way of a room that belonged to someone who had very specific ideas about where things were and kept them there. She was sitting behind her desk in her emerald green robes, which were as unrumpled as though she had never slept, or had slept in them without consequence. And she looked at him when he came in with an expression he couldn't immediately classify. Not angry, not warm, something more precise than either. She said, "Sit." He sat. She did not ask him how he was feeling. She did not ask him whether he'd slept well, or whether the dormitory was all right, or whether he was settling in. He understood in a moment that this was not oversight, that she knew exactly how he was and was not going to make him produce a performance of being fine, because she had been watching him for the better part of a decade and had read his notes aloud to 400 people the previous evening. She said, "There are reasons. You must return to your aunt's house at the end of term." He had been waiting since she said sit for a sentence, and this was not the sentence he'd expected. She said, "I cannot explain all of them to you today. Some of them will need to come from someone better positioned to explain them when you are older and have more of the context to receive them in. I want to be honest with you about the fact that I am withholding, because I think you have had enough experience of adults declining to tell you things without saying so, and I am not going to add to that." She looked at him evenly. "I am telling you there are reasons. I am telling you I cannot give you all of them yet. And I am telling you that this is not because you don't have a right to them, you do, but because the full picture is one that requires more than a second morning at Hogwarts. To absorb. Do you understand the distinction?" He said yes. He thought he did. He wasn't certain he'd have used the word understand. He thought it was more that he could see the outline of it, the shape of something he didn't have all the pieces of yet. He'd been looking at shapes like that his whole life. She said, "There is something I can tell you today, because it is true, and because you deserve to hear it directly from an adult rather than inferring it or not knowing it at all." She put her hands flat on the desk in front of her. It was a deliberate gesture, not nervous organizing. She said, "The reasons you had to be at Privet Drive have nothing to do with whether you deserve to be there. You did not deserve what you had there. The conditions in which you were raised were inadequate, and I said so in writing in the early hours of November, the 2nd, 1981, and everything I said in that notebook about the Dursley household was accurate." She said it steadily, without flinching from it, the way she read everything. "You deserved better. I want you to know that someone said so, at the time, clearly and on the record, and I am not the only one at Hogwarts who holds that view." Harry looked at the desk. He was aware of a quality of pressure behind his eyes that he was managing very carefully. He was 11 years old, and he had been managing this kind of pressure for 11 years, and he was quite good at it. But the management took effort, and he was currently applying all of it. He said, "Why did you keep them?" She said, "The notes." "For 10 years." She said, "I kept them because I knew what I had seen, and I knew I had been correct, and I knew that being correct had not changed anything, and I could not accept that being correct would simply dissolve over time into nothing acted upon. I kept them because at some point you were going to arrive at Hogwarts, and I was going to have a platform, and I needed you to know that someone was there." On the 1st of November, 1981, on a cold brick wall in Surrey, a woman was watching what happened to you. She watched it and called it wrong. She could not fix it. She did not forget it. And she did not forget you. She paused. That is why I kept them. He was very careful not to cry. He'd had a lot of practice at not crying, and he applied it and it worked, mostly. There was still the quality of pressure, but it stayed where he put it. He said, "Why didn't Professor Dumbledore just—" He stopped. He didn't know where the sentence was going. He'd had a version of this question forming since the previous evening, since he'd been standing in the hall listening to a man in a very important chair say the word failure in a very quiet voice, and it had more than one ending, and none of them were clear. Why didn't he just stop it? Why didn't he just tell someone? Why didn't he just— He didn't know how to finish it, because he didn't have enough of the picture yet to know what question he was actually asking. McGonagall looked at him for a moment. She said, "That is a question worth asking." He waited. She said, "I am not going to answer it for you today, because the answer requires pieces you don't have yet. But I want you to hear me say, it is a question worth asking. It is not a question that has an easy answer. And when you are older, when you have more of the context, and you will get the context, I intend to make certain of that. You should ask it of him directly." She held his look. "You are allowed to ask it," he thought. "I know." He thought it, and then he held it for a moment and realized that he hadn't known it exactly. Not until last night. Not until he'd asked a question in front of 400 people without knowing he was asking, and the world had not ended, and the very important man had answered him. He had not known until last night that he was allowed to ask questions about his own history in rooms where the answers were kept. He said, "All right," she said. "One more thing. At Hogwarts, I am your head of house. That is not an administrative category. It means I am the adult at this school who is specifically responsible for your well-being, not only your marks and your conduct, though those also. If something is wrong, you can come to me. If something happens that you don't know how to manage, you can come to me. If you need to ask a question in a room where someone is obligated to hear it." She made a small, precise gesture with one hand, indicating the room they were in. "This is that room. Do you understand?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Good." She straightened in her chair, which was the small movement that indicated something was concluding. "Go and have your breakfast, Mr. Potter. The term begins this morning." He stood. He went to the door. He had his hand on the frame when he said, without entirely planning to, "Professor." He looked back at her. "Thank you." She looked at him. Her expression was difficult to read in the way that precise things were sometimes difficult to read because precision left less room for inference. She said, "You are welcome." He went out. The corridor was empty and quiet, and the light was the pale, early light of a morning that hadn't fully committed yet. He stood in it for a moment, with his hand still on the frame of the door he'd closed behind him, and he understood, in the blunt, unadorned way of someone who has just had a thing happen to them, and is registering what it means. Not fixed, nothing was fixed. He still had to go back to Privet Drive at the end of term, and there were still reasons he didn't have all of, and nothing about the previous 10 years had become smaller or less real. But he had lived for 11 years inside a particular belief, which was that he was not the kind of person who was noticed or accounted for, that his absence from the calculations of the people around him was a fact about him rather than something that had been done to him. He had carried that belief, the way you carried something you'd picked up so young you couldn't remember its weight, as separate from your own. He could see now that it was separate. He could see the outline of it, the shape of it held away from him, distinct. He had been invisible because a specific set of people had arranged things so that he would be. That was not the same as being invisible by nature. He was not invisible by nature. He put his hands in his pockets and walked down the corridor toward the smell of breakfast and the sound of the castle beginning to wake up around him, and he was not fixed, he was not fine exactly, and he was also, for the first time in his life. The ceiling of the great hall showed the beginning of a September morning, high grey cloud with the light just beginning to work its way through, the kind of sky that hadn't decided yet what it intended to be. It was different from last night's ceiling, which had been black and scattered with stars, and it was somehow reassuring that the ceiling changed, that it was actual sky rather than a fixed decoration, that the room responded to the world outside it. Harry sat down between Ron and Hermione at the Gryffindor table, and the table was full of food, and the food was real. He had been here 12 hours. He had eaten dinner the previous night and gone to sleep in a bed, and woken up and had a conversation in an office, and walked back through a corridor and arrived at breakfast, and the sequence of it. The ordinary sequence, the way one thing followed another in the morning way of things, had a quality he didn't have a word for yet. Familiar was the wrong word. He hadn't been here long enough for familiar, but something in the sequence felt like a thing that was going to happen again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and the idea of that of days, following in sequence, in a place that was his, was doing something to his chest that he was not going to examine closely at a breakfast table. Hermione was very carefully not asking him anything. He could see her not asking. The particular containment of someone with a great many questions who has decided, on this specific occasion, to keep them inside. She passed the pumpkin juice without looking at him in the way of someone making a studied choice about where to look. Ron, for his part, was already eating with the concentration of someone for whom breakfast was a primary commitment, and he reached across Harry to get a piece of toast and handed it to him without comment. Harry took it. He ate. He ate in the way he had been eating for a month, thoroughly, without waste, with the low-level surprise of someone whose body had not fully updated its expectations. The great hall had more food on the table than the Dursleys put out for a week, and it was for everyone, and there was enough. And he did not have to negotiate for it or watch his portions against someone else's wants. He ate. This was a small private thing, and the narration did not comment on it further. Hermione said, very quietly, "I'm going to the library this morning," Harry said. "I think I have some questions too." She looked at him sideways. She said, "I thought you might." Ron said, without looking up from his plate, "I knew there'd be a library." Hermione began to tell him that the library was an extremely important resource, and that he would also find it useful if he would simply try, and Ron continued eating with the expression of someone who had heard a version of this argument many times already. Harry watched them over his toast. They had known each other for one day. He had known each of them for one day. And yet, there was something in the way they argued, the way it had the rhythm of something that had found its groove, the way Hermione's voice had the precise edge of someone who expected to be ignored and had prepared anyway, that felt like the beginning of something that was already in motion, like watching a river from a bridge and understanding from the way it moved that it had been moving long before you arrived. He looked down the table. At the far end of the Gryffindor table, Neville Longbottom was feeding something under the table to his toad. The toad, Harry remembered, sat in his palm with the placid resignation of an animal who had learned that being frequently misplaced was simply the condition of his existence. Neville was wearing his Gryffindor robes and looked as though he had slept a little better than Harry had, but not much. He was looking at his plate, then he looked up. Across the breadth of the Gryffindor table, across the noise and the food and the ordinary Tuesday morning of it all. Neville looked at Harry, and Harry looked back at Neville. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing obvious to say. But there was a thing in the look, a quality of recognition, that was not quite familiarity, and was not quite sympathy, and was not any of the words Harry had available, that had to do with November 1981. He didn't know what had happened to Neville's family. He knew the shape of it, the shape of a loss that had been living behind someone's eyes for as long as they could remember, because he had been looking at that shape in his own mirror his whole life. He recognized it across a breakfast table. Neville looked back at his plate. Harry looked back at his. Trevor disappeared under the table again. At the high table, the staff were having breakfast in the way that staff had breakfast when the staff included people who had spent the previous evening in a remarkable situation and were now engaged in the ordinary work of pretending that mornings happened to everyone equally. Harry watched the high table the way he'd learned to watch things without being obvious about it, not directly, with peripheral attention, the way you watched a door you weren't sure about. McGonagall and Dumbledore were seated at their respective places. They were not speaking to each other. They were not obviously not speaking. There was no visible tension, no angled chairs, no studied avoidance. They were simply two people at a table who were both eating breakfast and had each for the moment. Then Dumbledore reached for his goblet and raised it very slightly, barely perceptibly, in McGonagall's direction. It was not a toast. It was not approval or congratulation or any of the things that a raised goblet usually signified. It was something smaller and more specific than any of those things. An acknowledgement, the kind that passed between people who had spent the night arriving at an understanding and were recognizing in the morning that the understanding had been reached. McGonagall held his look for a moment, then she returned to her breakfast. Harry looked away. He thought he understood, approximately, what he had seen, and he thought that the approximately would fill in over time. At the high table, not far from Dumbledore, Severus Snape was eating his breakfast and watching Harry Potter. He was watching him the way he watched things when he needed to watch them, without appearing to watch them, with a quality of attention that had no visible object, that distributed itself across the table and the room, and returned at intervals to the specific point it had chosen. The point it had chosen this morning was a small, thin 11-year-old boy with black hair that needed cutting and round glasses and green eyes. Lily's eyes, identical, the same shape and the same particular shade of green that Snape had spent 20 years trying to think of as simply a color rather than a reference. He had not succeeded. He was not succeeding this morning. The boy was eating toast. He was eating it with the straightforward hunger of someone for whom food was not a guarantee. And Snape noted this in the category of things he had filed and would not look at directly. He had a very large category of that kind. It had been accumulating since the previous evening, when Minerva McGonagall had stood at the front of the Great Hall and read from a notebook about a house in Surrey where Lily's sister lived, and Lily's son had grown up in it. And it had been the kind of house that Lily would not have recognized as a place anyone could be expected to grow up in. And Snape had sat at the high table and applied everything he had to the work of sitting still. While this information entered the room, he had kept himself alive by being very good at sitting still when information entered rooms. He was good at it now. He would continue to be good at it. What he did with it was his own business. What he did with the knowledge that Lily's son had eaten this morning like someone recalibrating towards sufficiency, that was private, filed in the category with the rest of it, put away with the precision of someone who knew that the only alternative to precision was dissolution, and dissolution was not available to him. He had things to do, had years of things to do yet, in this school, in this life, watched from many directions by people who could not know what they were watching. He was going to sit at this table and eat this breakfast and conduct himself as he always conducted himself, which was as a man with nothing particular on his mind. He returned to his plate. He said nothing. He was, and had always been, very good at saying nothing. It had kept him alive this long, and it would go on keeping him alive, and that was what mattered. And he was not going to look at the boy at the Gryffindor table again until he was certain his face was doing what he needed it to do. He reached for his tea. The morning continued around him. Harry looked at Ron and Hermione. Hermione was now explaining the enchantment on the ceiling, not for the first time, Harry suspected, judging by the way Ron was nodding with his mouth full in the manner of someone who had made peace with receiving information he hadn't asked for and found it was usually interesting anyway. She had clearly been to the library already this morning, or had read something on the train, or had simply retained the relevant fact from the book in question and produced it at the appropriate moment. She was the kind of person who had appropriate moments queued up in advance. Harry was beginning to understand. He thought this would probably be useful. Ron swallowed. He said something with toast in it. Hermione said something back. The ordinary argument resumed. Harry looked at them. These two people he had met yesterday, who were apparently going to be in his life now, who talked around him the way people talked around someone they had already decided was included. He had not been included before as a default assumption. He had been the exception to things, the afterthought, the inconvenience, the child-shaped gap in other people's arrangements. He knew what it felt like to be present in a room and not registered. He knew the texture of that particular absence. This was not that. He didn't know yet what the blood protection meant, or why he had to go back, or what the years ahead contained, or who the man in the black robes at the high table would turn out to be over time, or what questions he would one day be old enough to ask and receive the full answers to. He knew almost nothing. He had arrived yesterday, and the yesterday had been extraordinary, and he was still at the beginning of understanding what had happened in it. He was 11 years old, and the world was larger than he had been told, and he had been here for less than a day. But he knew this. Last night, a woman in emerald green robes had stood at the front of a room full of strangers and read aloud from a notebook she had kept for 10 years. 10 years of watching and documenting and being told that her professional judgment was insufficient and her concerns were not enough and the full picture was not hers to have. She had kept the notebook anyway. She had waited until he arrived. She had read every word of it so that 400 people would know what had happened, and so that he would know that someone had been there, someone had seen it. Someone had called it wrong and could not fix it and had not forgotten, not in 10 years, not once. He thought, that is the kind of person he would like to be, not famous. Not the boy who lived, which was a category that had been applied to him before. He was old enough to have an opinion about categories. Not a hero in any of the shapes that word usually took, just a person who noticed. A person who watched what happened to people and wrote it down honestly, and did not look away from it, and did not let themselves be told that they didn't need to know, or that the picture was not theirs to have, or that what they had seen was not what they had seen. A person who kept the record and waited for the moment when the record could be read aloud, the kind who notices, he thought, and does not forget. He reached for another piece of toast. The ceiling, lightened by degrees above the great hall, the grey burning slowly off, and the morning came in through the high windows and fell across 4 long tables, and the students eating their breakfast and beginning to talk about ordinary things, schedules and classes, and whether the moving staircases were a problem or a feature, to itself, in the way that rooms returned to themselves after extraordinary things had passed through them. Not erasing what had happened, not pretending, but layering it under the ordinary. and continuing. The ordinary was what you came back to when the extraordinary had finished, and it was where you had to live, and it was worth fighting for. Harry ate his toast. The morning continued. September